Well, yeah. That pretty much rings the death knell, doesn't it? Netflix has canceled Daredevil, and yeah. I went back and checked the date. It was 8 months ago that I did my video saying that I was expecting all these shows to wrap up. And while I was wrong about the timing, in that both Jessica Jones and The Punisher ended up both getting one more season, which I didn't think was going to happen. It does now look like I was ultimately right, and everything is panning out getting canceled. Because if they have canned Daredevil, like, for me right now, the only big question is, do they drop the pretense and just admit up front that the currently in production third season of Jessica Jones and second season of Punisher are going to be the last for those respective shows? Or are they going to keep up the pretense and actually let those go to air and then announce the cancellation afterwards? Because there is no way that they do any more of this stuff after the fact. Now, there's a couple things I want to address about this, about the show in particular, and about the, what could happen with all of this stuff afterwards. So, this is not a decision being made by Disney. Netflix has the control over whether or not these shows continue. So it's Netflix's call if these get canceled and when. And for as long as they want to keep them running, the license to use them gets renewed. So before anyone gets all conspiratorial that Disney is telling Netflix to get rid of it, Disney actually can't. That's not the agreement that they have. Netflix has control of these things. Now, once these shows get canceled, Disney does get the IP back to be able to do with it what they want, and I'll come back to that in terms of what maybe could or is more or less likely to go on as far as that goes. But let's come back to Daredevil specifically. First of all, I said in my review of season 3 that I would be okay with that being the last season, and I stand by that. I know they set up a couple of things. They set up some more stuff to go on with Bullseye, but I feel like they sat, in a way at least that I found satisfying, wrapped up the Kingpin storyline, and that was kind of what I was in the show for. That was the big hook for me in season 1. It's what I missed the most in season 2, and I felt satisfied with what we got in season 3. So I'm good with it ending there, all things considered. Now, again, Jessica Jones and The Punisher are going to get their next seasons because they're already in production. I think actually they might both be done shooting and are in post-production at this point. But, like, that's going to be it for these things. There is no question that these things are winding down and are being, put on the back, or not put on the back burner, being just done. Netflix is done with them. So, what does that mean for these shows and the future of these characters? Well, here's the first thing that won't happen. The shows, the seasons that have already been produced, so The Defenders, 2 seasons of Iron Fist, 2 seasons of Luke Cage, 3 of Daredevil, ultimately 3 of Jessica Jones, and 2 of Punisher, are not going to migrate over to the Disney streaming app that's coming out. I think it's 2020 it's supposed to launch. Because, again, Disney does not actually have the control of these things. What Netflix had an arrangement that was a standard licensing of IP. And much like, even though Disney, because they own Marvel, owns Spider-Man, even when they integrated the Spider-Man into the MCU, they didn't suddenly gain control of all the other Spider-Man movies Sony had ever made. Those are still Sony's. These shows will still be Netflix's shows. So those are never going to move over, and Netflix has reiterated that, I believe. I should have double checked that. I saw that somewhere, but it tracks. There's no reason that this would ever move over. In addition to the fact that Disney has said repeatedly that they are not intending to put R-rated content on the Disney streaming service. Now, there's an open question to whether or not they're going to have a secondary streaming service, considering that when they bought Fox, they actually got their hands on a lot of R-rated IP and back catalog. So what the heck happens to that? We don't know, but it will not be on the Disney streaming service. Disney Plus, I think they're officially calling it. So that's not going to end up there. And these, even if they were to come off Netflix, they still wouldn't end up there because of the branding that Disney's doing with the whole thing. So, assuming that the shows, that the rest get canceled, can Disney continue the shows on their own streaming service? Because, sometimes shows change networks. Happened with Brooklyn Nine-Nine not too long ago. They could. I would be shocked if they did, though. Because, again, the first thing is the tone of these things doesn't match what they are going for on their own streaming service. So they'd have to be reconfigured in the first place, even if they were going to do that. But the other thing is they'd have to renegotiate all the contracts with these things because all the actors and everybody, their contract was with Netflix, not with Disney. So if Disney wanted to bring them back, they would have to get everybody back, get everybody to sign contracts again. They'd actually probably have to strike up a new licensing agreement with Netflix, because even though Disney owns, say, Daredevil and all the characters associated with it, the specific version of Daredevil that was put up on Netflix is Netflix's interpretation. It's their copyrighted interpretation. So Disney doesn't just get to continue that on their own without entering into basically a licensing agreement of the licensed material. It gets weird. So strictly speaking, it is not impossible that Disney could continue these shows, but there's really no reason for them to do it, especially given that Netflix, while they won't announce their actual viewing numbers, is saying that the reason they're cutting all these shows is they all had big viewer drop-offs. So there's really no motivation for Disney to go through the headache and the hassle to pick these things up again from where they left off. So I don't see that happening at all. So the question then becomes, what does happen with this IP? And this ends up being one of those situations where the artistic interests are going to clash with the business interests. Because the artistic interest would say, don't do anything with any of them for a while, because we're fresh off a recent interpretation from Netflix. So we need to just let these things sit, let people digest and be done with that. And then we'll do our own thing a little bit later down the line. And the business logic is, these are known quantities, these are established IPs, these are characters people know. If we put them on the back burner and don't do anything with them, we're leaving money on the table. So I'll be interested to see how that clash resolves. They're not going to kick these things up immediately, because Disney is already working on shows, MCU, Marvel shows, specifically for the streaming service, that are much more intimately connected with the films. Like the one they're working on right now, or at least have announced and are in development on, is Scarlet Witch and the Vision. And obviously with the intention of bringing those actors in from the films. And let's be honest, as much as we had the promise of all this being part of the MCU, and technically it is, the Netflix shows never really made that connection very strongly. And it only ever kind of went in one direction. Like the Netflix shows would occasionally reference the Chitauri invasion of New York. And we saw a little bit of Chitauri weaponry in Luke Cage. That's kind of it, though. And there was nothing in the films, which are much more widely watched than the Netflix show, that ever acknowledged the Netflix series. So this was a very threadbare connection that really only went in one direction. So for the continuity hounds, and this is going to drive you guys crazy, and I'm sorry, but you're not, I don't consider myself a continuity hound, but the people who it's really going to bother that, they're going to kill what is considered to be a segment of the existing continuity and then possibly replace it and negate all that. Yeah, Disney won't care. And as far as the continuity goes, there was so little connective tissue, it's not that hard to excise really at all. And it's funny because you think back, the MCU has ditched more stuff than you tend to think of, given how much of a well-oiled machine it is at this point. We tend to remember, oh yeah, they've replaced actors because Rhodey was originally Terrence Howard, but there's been whole plot threads dropped. Whatever happened to the guy who was going to become the leader in the Incredible Hulk? So cutting stuff loose isn't exactly new ground for Marvel and the MCU. That said, cutting stuff loose and then bringing it back as a whole new thing that basically says flat out, yeah, that other version didn't happen before, that would be new territory. But I still would imagine that there's enough of a business interest in making use of these characters that it's going to happen eventually. Exactly when and how it happens, that is an open question, because even though these are characters that have been on a streaming service, have been on a TV show, once Disney gets them back, they can put them in the movies. Again, I would expect they will get new actors and they will be new interpretations, but they can put them in the movies. They're not restricted to keeping them in TV. But all of this is going to be like 2 to 4 years down, like 2 years soonest. I would say 4 years is the more realistic down the road before we see any of these characters turn up again. And that's not because of the artistic side saying let it rest for a while, winning out. That's because, as we've already seen with Disney taking over the X-Men stuff, they are not going to reconfigure their existing plans in order to fast track the stuff they just got their hands on. Kevin Feige said repeatedly, like, look, we have our own plans going forward for a while. Once we have control of X-Men again, we will do something with that, but we're not going to jam that in and scrap all the existing plans. And I expect that to hold the same for when they get a hold of these other characters back again from Netflix. So the sort of the lingering thing in the air is when they actually do something, whenever it is, however it is, whether it's film or TV, what are we going to be looking at? And for my money, their best bet is to do something distinctly different from what the Netflix version was. And I mean, the easy way to go and you could do this with pretty much every character except Jessica Jones and maybe the Punisher, but basically just to make them more comic booky. Because if you lose the gritty, grounded street level elements of Daredevil and Iron Fist and Luke Cage and lean into the more over the top stuff, which is, Netflix did partly as a stylistic choice and partly because the over the top stuff is more expensive, and you lean into that and you lean into the garishness and you put Iron Fist in the suit and you do that kind of stuff, it will have a distinctly different feel and a distinctly different flavor to it. I mean, let's not forget, there was not a ton of time between the end of The Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man Homecoming. But I think a big part of how they got away with that, aside from the fact that people didn't really seem to want any more of the Amazing Spider-Man movies, was because this was a distinctly different feel. So it didn't feel like, oh, we're starting over, but it's essentially the same thing. We might as well have kept the same continuity. It's like, oh, no. Different feel to the character, different feel to the world he's inhabiting, different feel to the supporting cast. Okay. And that's probably what will happen with these characters whenever they put them up. Now, I did sort of say Jessica Jones and the Punisher are a little bit odd man out on that possibility, though, because both of them, I mean, not to say Punisher has never been garish and over the top. He has, but nobody likes that version of the Punisher. Everybody likes the gritty version of the Punisher. So with Netflix having kind of already tackled that, I'm not sure that Disney could safely do a new interpretation of him that could be wildly different, because it just wouldn't be the Punisher anymore. I feel there's enough wiggle room, certainly on Iron Fist and Luke Cage. I would argue also in Daredevil, you could move them away from the grittier stuff and still have enough to work with. You move Punisher away from gritty and he gets kind of silly. You can look at some of the really weird periods in the comics with him to see that. And Jessica Jones even more so, because she's such a recent character. She was the newest created out of all these. So she has much less of a back history. And while you can argue how, close to the comics in terms of the details of the story or the specifics of the characterization, the feel of it is very true to the comics. And it's kind of hard to go another direction with her, because what we got on the screen is kind of her whole shtick. She's damaged and drinks a lot and deals in, the underside of what goes on around here. That's what they presented us. There really isn't another way to go with her. So I would say that there's a pretty good chance Jessica Jones is going to be the one out of this lot who we just don't see again. Definitely not before we see any of the others, because I think that property is young enough that a lot of people are going to consider the existing show of Jessica Jones to be the definitive Jessica Jones. Whereas even something like The Punisher, you can look back and say, oh, well, there's the Dolph Lundgren movie and the Thomas Jane movie and the Ray Stevenson movie, and now we got they're all very, well, maybe not Warzone, which is why I love Warzone, but they're variations on the gritty revenge thing. But, there's been enough, it's been touched on enough again that you think, oh, what's one more? Jessica Jones, I do think it would be a bit more of a, why do it again? It's been done and you can't do it better than that. But we'll see. So, like I said, these characters, Disney will get them back. Disney will probably end up using most of them at some point. But again, my call is 4 years out, and it could be film, it could be TV. It kind of depends on what they want to do with their TV and their streaming space. I would think it might honestly be more likely that they show up in film, possibly initially in supporting roles, just because it will beg less comparison than if they do a streaming show. Because then we're already going to be comparing this earlier version of Luke Cage or Danny Rand to any later incarnation, but you really can't avoid the comparison if you do it in the same format. So, yeah, I think that's kind of where I land on that. But, Daredevil canceled. The other ones are on borrowed time. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But what are your thoughts on all this? Whatever they are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Whole bunch of stuff you can do, because there's buttons and there's links, and there's a link to my Patreon if you feel like supporting me that way. If you don't worry about it. Other links you can check out. Don't want to look at those? That's fine too, because at the end of the day, folks, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.